The adulteration of our food supply with sugar has turned our food supply into a drugified food supply, meaning that when we eat food, we will have difficulty stopping at the point of satiety, because not only are we getting from food the calories that we need to maintain life, we are also getting dopamine hits. This is real. Sugar very clearly releases dopamine. Sugar is a drug.
I think that's the central point that I really want to understand is what role dopamine plays.
If you eat something like meat, for example, you will reach a kind of a natural satiety point because you're not simultaneously working on the brain's reward pathway. So if on top of living in a world, in an ecosystem where food has been turned into a bona fide drug, you are also somebody who is wired for a food addiction, that's going to be a very difficult combination to overcome.
What does someone do in this world right now when they're noticing they have this habit of eating processed foods? Let's say you're thinking about trying to create healthy pathways in the brain.
It would begin with...
What's up, you guys? Today, I am bringing on Anna Lemke, who is the chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic at Stanford University. It's a mouthful, but she's also a specialist in the opioid epidemic in the United States, discussing the content about addiction. I think we've all struggled with, how do we stop eating sugar specifically, or how do we stop, doing fill in the blank, whether that's drinking or vaping, or a lot of people struggle with porn. It can go on and on and on. But specifically for this conversation, we discussed how dopamine can play into this reality, but then also how to harness this so that we can find control and kind of unlock the secret to all of this. There's no one better to talk about this than Anna. Obviously, she is the expert in this space of understanding dopamine and understanding addiction, and we dive deep into this today. Obviously, if you like it, please like it. If you're into this kind of stuff, all things human optimization, exploration, life hacks, go ahead and subscribe. Let's get into it. All right. So we live in a really interesting time today. I think the world is starting to pay attention to the food system and more so the addictive properties within our foods. So I'd be curious if you have any take on what you have seen in your research on people's addiction to food, or people that you've worked with, and what that looks like in ultra processed foods.
Sure. So food as a drug. This is real. Nucleus accumbens is the heart of the brain's dopamine reward pathway. It's rich in dopamine releasing neurons. Dopamine is our pleasure and reward neurotransmitter. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in that process, but it is the final common pathway for all reinforcing substances and behaviors. The more dopamine that's released in the reward pathway, and the faster it's released, the more likely that substance or behavior is to be reinforcing. Sugar very clearly releases dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Sugar is a drug. And the adulteration of our food supply with sugar, combined on top of that with salt and fat over the past 50 to 100 years, has turned our food supply into a drugified food supply, meaning that when we eat food, we will have difficulty stopping at the point of satiety, because not only are we getting from food the calories that we need to maintain life, we are also getting dopamine hits. It is activating our brain's reward pathway. It is reinforcing above and beyond its nutritional value, which means it's very hard to stop eating ultra-processed food, that is food with the addition of fat, salt, sugars, and flavorants, at the point that we have had enough food, because our brain tells us, oh, that dopamine hit felt really good, and so I want you to do it again and again, because that's the job of dopamine, right? It's our treasure-seeking, treasure-hunting, reward, pleasure neurotransmitter. It's very important to survival over millions of years of evolution. It's the neurotransmitter that says this is important to your survival, pay attention, and potentially do it more.
Yeah, it's I think that's the central point that I really want to understand very deeply, is what role dopamine plays. And you just said it right there. It's this is something that's part of being human is like, and not just human, I think an animal is having dopamine. It guides us to things that are going to help us survive, let's say. So like when we were evolving, that would be calories. If we could find something that has an abundance of calories, like fruit, which is kind of hard to find, they were scarce back in the day. Like, okay, that's going to help us survive until the next day or for the next 3 days or whatever it could have been, right? In your opinion, from what you're seeing with all of your research, and I'm sure your staff that you work with, I mean, you're kind of like at the top of the tier here in understanding this. Like, do you think that our foods today are designed to trigger our dopamine neurotransmitter in a way that like we have to keep buying it and keep eating it, and that's what the obesity is coming from? Or what is this that's going on?
Yeah. So that's very much what is going on. I mean, food has been turned into a drug, again, with the addition of salt, fat, sugar, and flavorants, which combined make food highly reinforcing, which means that eating food triggers the same reward pathway as drugs and alcohol. It is reinforcing. Now, there's interindividual variability in terms of how reinforcing food is. People differ in terms of what we call their drug of choice, depending upon our unique wiring. And I think some of that is environmental too. Like if you grew up in a family where love was expressed through food, that could add to it. But I really think it's fundamentally biological in the sense that some people's brains really are primed for food, whereas other people's brains are going to be more primed for other types of rewards. So if on top of, living in a world and an ecosystem where food has been drugified, turned into a bona fide drug, you are also somebody who is wired for a food addiction, that's going to be a very difficult combination to overcome. Because your brain's reward pathway will clearly light up when you ingest sugar, when you ingest carbohydrates combined with fat and salt, when you ingest chemicals that have been designed in a laboratory, like French toast ice cream, right?
Yeah,
right. To make it
Cheetos.
That much more reinforcing. By the way, one of the ways to make a drug more potent is to combine multiple different sensory stimuli or multiple different drugs together.
Like, what do you mean?
Like taking something like a Dorito and that already has salt and fat and sugar in it, and then adding lime flavoring to it, right? Now we've got a little bit of, and so it's even more potent in terms of its reinforcing potential.
Or like textures too, maybe? Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
like,
sure.
Is that a part?
Yeah, smells, sights, all of that. Kind of a multimodal sensory experience. There's a great saying in Chinese cuisine, 四香味儿, which means 颜色的色 is color, 香 is smell, and 味儿 is taste. And all of those things create a culinary experience. Something people have known for millennia. And of course, now it's being leveraged or exploited to sell us lime-flavored potato chips, for example.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating with dopamine because I've studied this quite a bit. Like I'm the type of person that I have a very extreme personality. So I'm like my full-time job, I'm a sales director at a Fortune 500 company. And what does that mean? It's like a lot of my ability to keep going, and it's hard to do, or to teach people to keep going in sales, let's say, is by that like dopamine reward that you get from achieving something or hitting a goal or quota or whatever it may be, right? So that's part of me. I don't drink anymore because when I did drink, and this is, I think, very common, it's just not talked about as much as, you drink 6 times out of a month, let's say, or out of a month, whatever. And one of those 6 times you inevitably drink too much. And it's, that's a pretty common thing. So that's how I was. And then, I eat carnivore because if I even have like a couple bites of processed foods, I just want to keep going and going and going. And it ruins my life when I do that. So I'm pretty much like pretty vanilla with everything now, but I think it's fun. It's cool for me to understand dopamine because it makes it make sense. Isn't it true that there's almost like a level that dopamine wants to be at all the time? And then it kind of corrects if we bring it too high up? Is that right?
Yeah. So we're always releasing dopamine at a tonic baseline level in the brain. I sometimes talk about it as the heartbeat of the brain. And when we do something that's pleasurable or reinforcing, we temporarily increase dopamine above baseline levels, and that feels good. And that's a signal to us that this is important for our survival. We should try to do this again. We should try to get more of it. And of course, our brains evolved for a world of scarcity. So not only should we get more of whatever this is, but as soon as we get it, we should consume all of it at once.
Take it all in,
because, who knows when we're going to see this again. The problem is that our brains really evolved for us to have to work very hard to get a little bit of reward. And now we get access to these incredibly potent reinforcing substances and behaviors without very much effort at all. And as a result, our brains are reeling to try to adapt or compensate to the explosion in dopamine release. And they do that by essentially downregulating dopamine transmission, not just back to baseline, but actually below baseline into this dopamine deficit state. So I talk about this teeter-totter or this pleasure-pain balance. And when we get, on the pain side or in that dopamine deficit state, now we're in the state of craving. We're experiencing withdrawal. Universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. And in that state, we want to get back to baseline or homeostasis as quickly as possible, because that's an overriding physiologic imperative for all living organisms, right? We want to stay within our homeostatic bounds. The fastest way to do that is to consume more of whatever our drug is. The problem is that with increased exposure, we get less and less upward deflection in terms of dopamine release, but that downward deflection to the dopamine deficit side gets stronger and longer. And eventually we can settle out in a chronic dopamine deficit state, which means that now we've changed our hedonic or joy or dopamine set point. And now we need to keep consuming that drug, not to feel good and get high, but just to bring us back up to baseline and feel normal. And that's when we get into that addiction cycle.
Okay. Yeah. Your book was so interesting because you talked about how all these little stories of the people that you've worked with. And, I really do find addiction fascinating because it not only have I struggled with it, and, thankfully I never was, let's say, an air quote, an addict to alcohol. I gave it up before I think I needed to, really. My mom actually was an alcoholic and she passed away from alcoholism. So, it's okay. Thank you. But she was, a wonderful mom. So I was like extremely lucky. She was such a good mom. But I saw how alcohol, like you're talking about, it slowly deteriorates the mind and the body. Yeah. And it's this really weird thing to experience watching somebody, especially when you know them so well. Mm-hmm. So it almost helped me understand what was going on within me when I would have when you're 22, 24, you go out and you drink 15 drinks at night. And that's actually pretty normal. But then the next day it's so what you're saying with this dopamine thing is like, you're typically at this normal baseline. You drink all of this and the dopamine ticks up. You're like, okay, and then the next day it swings back down.
Right.
And so the body is doing everything it can now to help. It's basically down here and it's wanting you to work to make it get back up to normal.
Right.
But your body's saying, just give me the hair of the dog.
Right.
Just give me processed food. Give me, anything really, basically, to make it go back to normal. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah. And, it's so hard when we see somebody who is killing themselves with their addiction, whether it's alcohol or opioids or cannabis or gambling or sex or whatever it is. And it's so hard to understand why they would choose that behavior or that substance over life, right? And over their relationships. But once we understand the brain chemistry, we can really see that on some level, they're not choosing, right? They actually lose the capacity to choose because their reward pathway has essentially been hijacked by this very potent chemical, which has them in this vicious cycle of trying to restore homeostasis, which is really a powerfully overwhelming kind of physiology. Sometimes when I talk about it, I talk about, imagine that, you had no food to eat for a week and your children had no food to eat for a week. You would probably go to very great lengths to get even a small morsel of food. You would go outside your moral compass. You might even kill people, right, to get food for your children. It's possible if it came down to that, that people, would get into a very animalistic survival mode. That's what happens with people with severe addiction. Their brain then equates getting that drug with survival, because dopamine really is this very primitive, very evolutionarily conserved survival signal.
So if someone, let's say today, is struggling with eating ultra processed foods, which, let's be real, basically everybody is, right? It's very challenging because everywhere we go, there's ultra processed foods everywhere. Right. It's almost, I would argue, it's got to be harder than not drinking. And not that you can really compare, because there's so many variables that come to play with that, childhood and all that stuff. But you have to eat. You have to eat. And if 75% of the world, I think it's something like 75% or 85% of the diet that our kids eat today is processed foods. And so, that's a damn shame if you're thinking about trying to create healthy pathways in the brain to avoid addictive personalities, right? So, or let's say addictions in general.
Right.
What does someone do when they are in this world right now with all this food and they're noticing they have this habit of eating processed foods, let's say, and it could be anything. Let's use processed foods as an example. Is the way to go to just cold turkey, cut it out, and then do everything you can to exit it from your life so your brain has a chance to reconfigure a bit? Or what are you seeing?
Yeah. Well, if we conceptualize the food as a drug, as ultra-processed food as drugified, which I and many of my colleagues do now think of it that way. And then we conceptualize the behavior as an ultra-processed food addiction. Then the way that we intervene is very similar to how we would intervene for any drug addiction, right? It would begin with abstaining from that drug of choice. Now, when it comes to food, what that means is identifying what are the ultra processed foods in my life that once I begin eating them, I cannot stop, or I have difficulty stopping, or I tend to binge, or I tend to, lie about my use, or the other, or I have consequences from use, whatever they may be, stomach ache, other health consequences, engaging in purging behaviors. There are many variations on that theme. And so then the idea is that I would abstain from those foods. And so that would typically be things like anything that has sugar in it, or in some cases, any kind of highly processed starch. Eliminating those kinds of, some people think that dairy is highly processed, right? That cheese is highly processed. Might be eliminating dairy as well. You would sort of design it for yourself and then abstain from that food for long enough, theoretically, to kind of reset healthy baseline levels of dopamine. And in my clinical experience, that takes about 4 weeks on average. So the first 10 to 14 days, to begin to reset reward pathways. Yeah. So the first 14 days tend to be very, very difficult. I always say to folks, if you've ever tried to give up sugar, number one, it's hard because everything has sugar in it. But number two, it's hard because there's real withdrawal and perseveration and craving. But usually if we can get through the first 10 to 14 days, things start to get easier, which is paradoxical. You think when you give up your drug of choice that the craving will just get worse and worse the longer you go. But in fact, the opposite is true. And if you give it up for long enough, you can get to a point where you're not even thinking about it anymore, which is such freedom, right? But the idea is to give it up for a period of time and then to decide what you want to do. Do you want to go back to incorporating that kind of food in your life and trying to moderate consumption and eat it mindfully? Or do you really think you're better off just permanently eliminating that food from your life? That's the general approach. It's an approach that identifies certain types of food, that is ultra processed food, as a drug. And then it it proceeds with thinking about abstaining from that drug for long enough to begin to reset reward pathways. And then it works with looking at that person's goals and lifestyle choices and values and circumstances to then identify, okay, do you want to continue to abstain or do you want to try to moderate? Either way, it needs to be very intentional, thinking about what you're going to eat, how much and how often, if you're going to reincorporate that food into your life. If you're not, then it's going to be thinking about how to maintain abstinence. And one of the things I think is very important is what I call self-binding. This is where we acknowledge that willpower alone will not cut it, especially in a world where we're constantly being tempted to consume. So we have to create both literal and metacognitive barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice so that we can press the pause button between desire and consumption. So this is things as simple as getting that particular food out of the house, right? Not having easy access to it, not going to events where you know that particular food will be served, at least until you're further on in your recovery.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't have anything processed in my place.
Do you literally just eat meat? I mean, you don't eat vegetables. You don't eat any kind of starch. You 24/7, you eat meat.
Except maybe sometimes I'll have raw cheese. And this is what I was going to ask you about too, because I wonder, Anna, if this is something that y'all are studying, at Stanford. This is such a fascinating space, what carnivore is doing, because in my experience, I had eating disorders my whole life, like everything. And, I also had the addict. And again, it sounds like I was going to rehab. I really, not that I care what people think about me, but I want to generalize it more so with the drinking thing. Like I think young people struggle with alcohol more than they think. They have anxiety disorders. I was on antidepressants, et cetera, et cetera. Like that's common, air quotes, these days, but it doesn't necessarily need to be, in my opinion. And I think a lot of it comes back to this processed foods and drinking and other things. Yeah. So when I incorporated a carnivore lifestyle, it completely changed my life. It was insane.
Wow.
Like I don't crave any processed foods. I have complete satiety.
That's awesome.
I run miles very well. I lift weights. It's weird. And this is what we talk about a lot here, why so many people pay attention to some of the stuff I talk about here is because they're finding this too for them is they need like 5 or 6 hours of sleep as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. They wake up. It's like they don't need it.
Right.
And then
that makes
also
sense because carbohydrates would be more sedating.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then it's like beyond that, you would think, okay, well, it's just this weird thing where your body is like, your brain is on, you're on. So maybe you've heard this with people in ketosis. You don't necessarily have to be in ketosis to do carnivore. So like what I do is I just eat meat. It's basically every day is bacon, and then eggs, and then ground beef is pretty much what I stick with.
Okay.
And then, like I said, sometimes when I'm running, I'll have raw cheese. So I don't have processed cheese because it's, they kill the good bacteria in there too. So yeah, I mean, is this something that you guys are paying attention to in your field or not as much? Or what?
For sure. I mean, diet's maybe not the right word. Nutrition is probably the better word, has become a real focus for mental health, including psychiatry. I have a colleague who is studying, what do they call that diet? The gluten-free diet.
Okay.
Also the diet where you have just no bread at all. What's that one called? Sorry. It's not my area as you can see.
I don't know what that one is. There's so many different
ones. But the key is that there are a lot of people. And of course it makes total sense. I mean, what we put into our bodies is going to affect our bodies, including our brains. So yeah. And it's hard to eat healthy and it's hard to even know what healthy food is now because everything is promoted in this way. And so what you're doing is a kind of self-binding, right? You're restricting your diet to such a simple and narrow category of food that even if it's not necessarily true that it's the meat itself that is causing you to feel good and healthy, the simple fact that you're you've simplified things. It really cognitively unburdens you because your choices are very limited. And then also, any kind of starch is essentially going to be broken down into sugars. And as we've talked about, sugars are going to kick off this craving cycle. So you are preventing that by not ingesting foods that can cause a sudden rise in sugar levels, a sudden release of insulin, which is what can for many people be so addictive about food.
Yeah, it's fascinating to watch this happen because, I recently went to Africa. I just got back about 3 weeks ago, and there are these tribes there called the Maasai tribes. Have you heard of them before?
Yes.
Yeah, they're fascinating. I met them. They only eat meat, blood, and raw milk only, and they've been around for over 1,000 years. So and it's babies, the moms, the kids, the men, and they hunt. They basically do, they're nomadic. So they move around quite a bit, and they don't have any signs of disease. They don't have any addiction issues. So so far as we know, actually, they smoke nicotine, but it's not like this issue. No one's struggling. It seems like it. And so what I'm really leaning into with this carnivore lifestyle is okay, sure. There's so many air quotes diets. It's not really about the diet. It's actually what people what we shouldn't have, which in my opinion is at the very big front center, ultra processed foods. I think that's the thing. And being full helps you not want to eat those.
Right.
Yeah. So that's pretty cool. And I was curious about this whole thing with mice or rats. What is it? Rat Park? I think I don't know if you touched on that in your book, but I've heard this before what is that? The Rat Park study.
Yeah. So the Rat Park experiment was the lead scientist on that was Bruce Alexander, who basically he looked at the experiments that were being done in rats and mice, where they were put in a cage with only a lever to press to get access to cocaine as an experimental paradigm for addiction. And measuring how often they would press that lever for intravenous cocaine as a measure of how addicted they can get, and finding that most rodents will press a lever till exhaustion or even death in response to cocaine. So highly addictive drug for rats and mice.
They're going in. Yeah.
But Alexander said, well, if I were stuck in a cage with nothing to do but press a lever for cocaine, I would probably also get addicted to cocaine because there's nothing else to do.
Right.
Right?
It's fair.
That's fair. So he said, what happens if you take those same rats and you put them in an enriched environment where there are other rats and there are running wheels and there are little corners of sawdust and cotton balls and things to explore, a maze. He said, I hypothesized, he said, that was his hypothesis, that they're going to press the lever a lot less. And his results showed that that's in fact what happened. And so this experiment, which is called Rat Park, became kind of iconic for a larger social message, which is, if we lived in a more enriched environment where people had ways of accessing reward that were healthy, they wouldn't then need to turn to drugs in order to get some of these basic needs met. And so it's become almost a metaphor for thinking about not just what we shouldn't do, but what should we have more of, right? Intimate human connections, access to clean air and nature, exercise, healthy ways of getting dopamine. The problem is, if I don't mention it in my book, I certainly mention it in some interviews that I've done, that in the modern world, we've turned Rat Park into Rat Amusement Park, which is to say we've drugified human connection through social media. We've drugified physical fitness through all of the various ways that we measure ourselves and compare ourselves and try to push the human limits. Even a running wheel, it turns out, has the potential for addiction, almost like the way humans can like Ferris wheels and roller coasters. Some rats will run on a running wheel till exhaustion or death, because a running wheel by itself is a form of technology that allows us to move through three-dimensional space. The point being that Rat Park is a fine notion, but again, we now live in a time and a place when almost every human behavior and substance has been made more accessible, more potent, more novel, more bountiful. So essentially turned into a drug.
So let me ask you this, is there any problem with having our lives be led with the craving and then the achieving of more dopamine? You know what I mean? Like, what's the negative to that? Because the way I see it is my entire career has like pretty defined by dopamine. It's like teaching people how to do sales, which is driving revenue. And you either win or you lose, basically. When you win, dopamine hit. And you can find a lot of success in that as just like generating money for yourself, achievement. And then the same with like running. Why is it so bad to run a lot? Like, okay, fine. You run, you don't want to hurt yourself, but you know what I mean? Like, what's the problem with having dopamine lead our lives?
Well, I think first it's important to identify that dopamine is not a good chemical or a bad chemical. It's a necessary chemical for survival, and it's who we are. We are the ultimate strivers. We're always seeking something more, never satisfied with what we have. And that's what's allowed us to survive these millions of years and be, so dominant on the planet for better and for worse. The problem is that dopamine cycle now is so fast and so potent that we're all more vulnerable to the problem of addiction, which is defined as the continued compulsive use of a substance or a behavior despite harm to self and or others. So is running bad? No, running is not bad unless you run to the point where you're harming your body, right? Or you're running to the point where you now don't have time for other things that you value, like spending time with friends or family. In sales, that's your job. We live in a capitalist society. That's how it works. On the other hand, are you now so intent on making the sale that you are not getting enough sleep, that you are going outside your moral compass to get that sale?
So it's a balance.
Right. So the point is that it's getting harder and harder to find that balance. And yet we have to look for ways to do that, lest we get really caught up in that, sort of dopamine hedonic treadmill where we just feel trapped and can't get off and harm ourselves and harm other people.
Yeah. And with that, it's funny because I have this approach. I take this way of looking at things, I think, because of just my life experience is like, you can completely change your life if you want to. You really can. Luckily for me, I'm not somebody who ever had like a major addiction. I've never needed to. I'm still relatively young, right? Like there's a lot of people who are older, like my mom who struggled with that, or my uncle or whoever, right? I empathize with it totally. And at the same time, I think we create our own realities. We can change. But I get pushback from people saying they have a quote, addictive personality. And that's something that they struggle with. Personally, I think I have an addictive personality, which is also considered more of like an intense personality. Like when I go and focus on something, I really, really, really kind of lean into it. And I kind of think it's a superpower when directed in the right direction. So sure, maybe I have an, addictive personality, but does that even exist? Or is that just a thing that we make up as an excuse to not be accountable?
Oh, no, I think that does exist. And we don't use that terminology, addictive personality, anymore.
That's right.
We just talk about vulnerability to addiction, but we know from family and twin studies that people come into this world with different degrees of vulnerability to addiction. And for example, with alcohol, if you have a biological parent or grandparent with alcohol use disorder, you are at increased risk compared to the general population of developing alcohol use disorder yourself, even if raised outside of that alcohol using home. So there definitely is a multi-genetic propensity for addiction that's inherited and is distinct and separate from the way that we're raised or our, cultural or educational upbringing. And I agree with you that, this kind of tenacity or perseverance or willful exertion to reach a goal. It can in some ways be really great, but in other ways it's a huge burden to carry, right? And it's also, there's a time and a place when exerting our will is no longer a good idea, right? There are some situations where it's really better to let go. And so then you have to figure out, well, when are the situations where I should continue to exert my will, and when are the situations where it's really not good for me and or not good for other people for me to continue to try to, shape my destiny here. So I think, Mother Nature codes for all different types of temperaments. Some people are more active, some people are more passive. And the reason that Mother Nature has done that is because in some situations, survival will be optimized if people are more active. And in other situations, survival will be optimized if people are more passive. So, Mother Nature wants to be sure that there's somebody left at the end of the day as the environment changes, which it is constantly changing.
Yeah. Okay. Have you guys ever discovered they talk about that gene. There's like potentially a gene, let's say in alcoholics or like even in addicts. I've never seen that to be proven, like a specific gene.
No, there's not one gene that's been identified. Okay. It's definitely going to be a complex, multifactorial genetic phenomenon. I mean, there are some enduring traits like impulsivity or, cognitive problems or emotion dysregulation that tend to increase the risk of developing an addiction, but it's not one gene, no.
Okay. So, in just circling back to this carnivore approach, because I think it's fascinating I do think knowing what's going on in the brain is helpful to just like figure out how to proceed.
Yeah.
If one, let's say, you were saying that carnivore is probably helpful for people because a lot of what the starchy foods will break down to in the body is sugars, which therefore will raise our insulin levels, which will increase our hunger hormones, probably ghrelin and other things like that. Right. Is that right so far?
As well as working on the brain simultaneously to release dopamine, right? So it works on the gut and it works on the brain at the same time.
Okay. So both things are essentially screaming at us, like maybe keep eating more of it or like, this is good.
Or bottom line, this is good. Get more of this, consume as much of this as you can. This is good.
Okay. So in that moment, let's say we just ate something and our dopamine is baseline. And now because we ate it, the sugars are going up. It's sort of like, this is dopamine right here. It's increasing. It goes up, 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 up. Let's say we finish that meal 3 hours later, or even 2 hours later. Once the insulin levels drop, does the dopamine then drop down below to what the baseline was?
I can't tell you how it interacts specifically with dopamine level or with insulin levels rising and falling. The major point is that what goes up in the brain must come down when it comes to dopamine. And so the dopamine wants to return back to baseline levels. The way it does that once it's gone up is first to go down below those initial levels and then go back to baseline. That's the way that the brain kind of returns to that homeostatic baseline. So, for almost any intense rush, whether it's a sugar rush or some other kind of rush, there's usually a come down. And that come down can be experienced as craving for more, right? As a way to get back to either baseline levels or even above baseline levels.
Okay. So the come down is where those thoughts of like, those intrusive thoughts are like,
that's right.
Just go get it. Just do the thing.
Yeah.
That's likely when your dopamine levels are below baseline is what's happening.
Right. Whereas if you eat something like broccoli or, meat, for example, which doesn't have, sugars, or at least not easily accessible sugars, that means that you will reach a kind of a natural satiety point when your body tells you, I have enough calories, because you're not simultaneously working on the brain's reward pathway.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. It's so fascinating because it's like you only have access to the thoughts you have in that moment, right? Like when you're full and you feel full, you don't feel like running out and getting 10 gallons of ice cream. It just doesn't really cross your mind. And then 4 hours later, when you're hungry, suddenly, if you're coming off of sugar or something, that's all you want. And that's obsessive.
Right. And that's why the GLP-1 agonists are such interesting drugs, because things like Ozempic and Wegovy and things, because they work on the gut, right? By basically mimicking GLP-1 molecules that lead to and coordinate insulin release from the pancreas. But it's also thought that they work on the brain by decreasing the dopamine response to drugs, so that people are not as likely to get into that loop of craving.
Okay, so it's working on the hunger and the reward system of dopamine at the same time.
Yes.
Do you have an opinion about those? Is Ozempic, is it something that you're into?
I think it's the inevitable outcome of living in a world of overabundance, where we have, at least in rich nations, more food than we need, and that food has been enriched and drugified in all the ways that we've talked about. And the fact that our ancient wiring is mismatched for this world of abundance. We are really wired for a world of scarcity, in which there are few rewards that we have to work very hard to obtain. And once we get them, we should consume all of them, because you don't know what tomorrow will bring. We don't live in that world. And so to try and adapt to that world will require extreme measures in order to restore a healthy dopamine reward response. And I would consider the way that you eat it one version of an extreme measure, right? You're just eating meat, and it sounds like a little bit of dairy and some eggs. And that way you don't trigger this kind of drug reward response that all the processed foods that most people eat trigger. Another example of a response is to take a medication, which blunts the dopamine response. So you're eating the processed food, but you're not getting that same increase in dopamine firing that sets you up for that loop. And the way people talk about it is that it's just remarkable for them that instead of spending all day long thinking about and wanting food, they find that they're not doing that. And that must just be a very much of a relief for those folks who are wired for food addiction.
I remember my mom started taking this medication that was the same for alcohol. It's not like Ozempic. It was the same blocker, though.
Naltrexone, probably an opioid.
Yes,
yeah, right.
What is it called? Naltrexone?
Naltrexone. So it blocks the opioid receptor, and it works in a similar way as it blunts the rewarding response.
Right. And so then, and I know we're coming up on time, so I'll wrap this up here in just a sec. But the understanding of when you're saying like these people that have this obsessive, like almost compulsive need, this addiction, that's something that's developed over years and years and years of just kind of tinkering with its dopamine receptor, right? Like or is that wrong?
Yeah, I mean, the time scale, I don't think we know exactly, but I'm not sure it takes years and years. I think if your brain is wired to find a particular substance or behavior reinforcing, whether it's, again, gambling, shopping, sex, cannabis, alcohol, food, it doesn't take very many exposures. In some cases, maybe even a single exposure can set that person off and running into kind of a seeking pattern. Intoxication, withdrawal, drug seeking over and over again.
Okay. Because I was envisioning this erosion of like a pathway in your brain almost with, like you said, it changes the way your brain chemistry works over time when you bring dopamine up and down so many times away from the baseline. Eventually it messes up or rewires your reward system. That can also happen in one or two instances depending on the person and the substance.
I mean, it can. Yeah, probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess, would you be open to me connecting you with some people that are at, I think, Stanford? You might even know them, or a couple other, universities that are studying this food system, this like carnivore stuff. I think it might be really fascinating for the two of you guys to talk.
You know, I work with folks in Britain who are trying to get food addiction into the DSM, and I'm sure they're connected with Robert Lustig and all kinds of food. And I'm obviously not a food and nutrition expert, but I am. Sure. Thank you for the offer, but I actually am very well connected to this group, who I think is probably connected to those folks.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, whatever makes it happen. I think like there's such specialization going on, you know, that there's probably a central 1 or 2 or 5 central pieces that could maybe be connected to all of the issues.
Well,
food, whatever.
It's good. I mean, I've only heard about this carnivore diet. I heard about it about a year ago because some celebrities, I guess, are on the diet. And I will ask I'm talking to my food addiction friends in a couple of days. I will ask them what they know about it.
Cool. Yeah, that would be great. And love to connect you to some people if you decide you want to. But cool. I am super appreciative of the conversation today. I'm going to attach your book below. I thought it was awesome. I read through the whole thing.
Great.
It's really interesting because you go through your stories too and your own personal experiences.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, which I think is always, it makes it better because you're human. Right? You're not just this overlord.
Boy,
yeah. And that's real. So I'll attach that below. Is there anywhere in particular that people should go also to find you, Anna?
Not really. I'm not on social media. So no, but thanks for asking.
Sure. Yeah, no worries. You're staying off the social, controlling the dopamine.
Yeah. That would be my drug of choice for sure.
Yeah, that one I steer clear pretty well too. So I try not to. I just don't have time and I don't care. It's just another thing. So, but yeah, I will attach the book below for anybody who wants to snag it. And I appreciate the time. Thank you.
You're very welcome.